Let's have a look at the first layer of protection, the CORS layer. When a browser sends an AJAX request from one website to another, it is known as a cross-origin request. By default, browsers block such requests, leading to the all too familiar and frustrating error message in our console: access to blah 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 from origin blah 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 has been blocked. To tackle this issue, we have cross-origin resource sharing. CORS is an HTTP header-based mechanism that empowers a server to specify which origins are allowed to make requests to our server. This enhances security and provides a greater control over data flow between different origins. But what exactly is an origin? An origin is defined by three components: the protocol, the hostname, and, if specified, the port. So when comparing two origins, if any of these three parts are different, they are considered to be different origins. For example, when comparing a Vue SPA running on HTTP localhost port 5173 and the Laravel API running on HTTP localhost port 8000, the protocol is the same, the hostname is the same, but the port is different. So these two are different origins, and the browser will block any AJAX request sent from the SPA to the Laravel API, unless of course we properly configure CORS, in which case the server, Laravel, will essentially tell the browser, hey, it's okay, I know localhost 5173, I accept any requests coming from them. So essentially the browser acts like a club bouncer. It sits around and observes. For example, we have http://abc.com wanting to send a GET request to the http://myapp.com/api/user endpoint. The browser sees the request, checks the origin of the sender and the origin of the receiver, and says, hey sir, excuse me, these two are not the same. These are different origins. So this is a cross-origin request. I'm going to have to ask you to step aside and wait for a minute while I check with the server to see if he's cool with this request you're sending. Then the browser does what it's called a pre-flight request. It goes to the server and tells him, hey man, this abc.com dude wants to send you a GET request to this endpoint. Are you cool with it? The server then looks through the allowed origins list, sees that abc.com is not there, and essentially tells the browser, I've never heard of this man in my life, so hell no, he cannot send me any goddamn request. Get him out of here. And then you get a CORS error. But anyway, enough of this, let's see what CORS configuration options we have in Laravel. I'll open the CORS PHP config file, and we won't be starting from the top, we'll start with the most important config value, which is the allowed origins key. Right now, we are allowing requests coming from HTTP localhost port 5173. If we go in the browser and open up the network tab, hit login, we see we have a couple of requests here, two of which are those type of pre-flight requests we talked about. If I inspect one of these, we see the request URL is http localhost port 8000/login, which means we are dealing with a cross-origin request. The ports are different. Now, if we look at the request headers, we see we have these type of access control request type of headers. One that says we want to send the content type and XSRF token header, and the other one that says we want to make a post request. If we look at what the server told us, it told us that we are allowed to use credentials, we are allowed to send those headers, we are allowed to make a post request, and most importantly, our localhost port 5173 is an allowed origin, which means we are allowed to send requests to our Laravel API. If we are to go back to our config and change the port, for example, to some gibberish, go in the browser, hit login again, we have a CORS error. If we go in the console tab, we see that access control allow origin header contains the invalid value HTTP localhost port 321321. Which is different than our 5173 port, and that's why we're getting a CORS error. Let's put that back in, hit login again, and now everything is working. As for the other config values, we have paths, and here we can specify the exact endpoints that are allowed to receive cross-origin requests. If we remove the wildcard and go in the browser, hit login, we get a CORS error for Sanctum CSRF cookie. Let's go ahead and add that endpoint here. So Sanctum CSRF cookie. Hit login again. And now we get one for /login. Let's add /login here. Hit login again. and our requests are now successful. So here you can basically decide exactly which endpoints are allowed to receive cross-origin requests. Most of the times you'll want this to be a wildcard unless you have a very good reason not to. In the allowed methods key, we can specify which types of requests are allowed. Get and post requests are always allowed, but we can deny put, patch, and delete requests by omitting them from the list. So here, if we add put and patch, this will translate to allowing get requests, post requests, put requests, and patch requests. Delete requests will be rejected. Again, generally, you'll probably want this to be a star unless you have a very strong reason not to. The allowed origins, we've already talked about them. And here we have allowed origin patterns. This enables us to use wildcards to allow a wider range of origins. For example, we can go here and say star, localhost, star, and this will allow requests coming from localhost origins using various protocols and ports. So we can remove this from here, go in the browser, refresh, hit login, and it will still work because we are using a localhost origin. The port doesn't really matter right now. Moving on, we have allowed headers, and this lets us control which headers can be sent. So if we remove this, go in the browser, go in the console, hit login, we get an error saying that the XSRF token header is not allowed. So we can go back here and add it. Try again, and now the content type header is not allowed. Let's add that as well. Hit login, and we are good to go. The requests are successful. But again, unless you have a very good reason, this should probably be a star. Next up, we have exposed headers, and this setting lets you define which response headers can be accessed by JavaScript in the browser. Usually this one stays empty. Then we have max age, and this is an interesting one because it lets you specify an expiration date for your CORS settings. So if I enter, let's say 100 seconds here and go in the browser, I'll hit login. You'll see the pre-flight requests, but if I untick this to allow caching and then log in again, there are no more pre-flight requests being made. So this setting right here allows you to cache your CORS configuration. And finally, we have supports credentials set to true. And this one allows cross-origin requests to come with included credentials. These are cookies, HTTP authentication, and client certificates. In our case, we are most interested in receiving cookies. Now, one important thing to note here is that this setting works in conjunction with a front-end setting. This one from the server says, hey, I'm cool if you're sending me cookies via cross-origin requests. And then the one on the front end, if I open my use OSTore, this one right here with credentials set to true, or credentials include if you're using something like fetch, this one says, hey, I am including credentials. And both of these need to be set to true, otherwise your authentication with Sanctum won't work. To demonstrate this, we can go in the browser to the Network tab, and I'll hit Login, inspect the login endpoint, for example, or the CSRF cookie, doesn't really matter. If we look at the request headers, we see we are sending a cookie header with the XSRF token cookie and the Laravel session cookie. But now if we go to our front end and set this to false, I'll refresh, hit login again. We get a 419 because the CSRF token is no longer matching. And if we look at the headers, there's no cookie header. That's because we are not including them. So always set this to true. Refresh, login, and there we go. Now on the other side, if this is set to false, this basically says the server no longer accepts credentials via cross-origin requests. So if we go in the browser, log in, we get a CORS error saying that access control allow credentials, header in the response is an empty string, which must be true. So basically this one tells us that the server doesn't accept cross-origin requests with credentials. Now, as for this config file, what you probably want is this always needs to be true. You can use a pattern, but I prefer to specify the exact origin from the env file, front-end URL, and maybe set a default. This was the CORS security layer. Next up, we'll move a bit deeper and have a look over how CSRF protection works.